Picture a city that doesn't sit on the ground. It sits above it, built high on an ancient mound, ringed by walls so high they seem to scrape the desert sky. Below, an army of conquerors stares up in disbelief. They have just torn down the impregnable island fortress of Tyre after 7 brutal months. They have defeated every Persian force that has stood against them. But this city refuses to fall the easy way. Its governor is a eunuch, a man loyal to a crumbling empire, and he has filled Gaza with mercenaries and provisions rather than open his gates. What happens next will leave a king wounded, a garrison annihilated, and, according to one ancient historian, a captured commander dragged through the dust in deliberate imitation of Achilles. Welcome to Gaza, 332 BC, the siege where Alexander the Great built a mountain to reach a city, and where one of his greatest engineering victories became attached to one of the darkest stories ever told about him. Before we descend into the sand and the siege lines, hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell. This channel exists to drag history's darkest turning points out of the shadows, and you don't want to miss what is coming. Now, let us go back to the Eastern Mediterranean, where one stubborn city was about to test Alexander's patience, his reputation, and his blood. By the autumn of 332 BC, Alexander the Great was no longer just a Macedonian king chasing glory. He had become the most dangerous man in the Persian world. About a year earlier, at Issus, he had defeated an army that probably outnumbered his own, and sent the great King Darius III fleeing from the battlefield, abandoning his mother, wife, children, baggage, and royal camp in the chaos. The military defeat was devastating. The humiliation was worse. Alexander did not chase Darius east immediately. He turned south along the Mediterranean coast instead, dismantling Persian power port by port. The logic was ruthless and precise. Persia still possessed ships, but fleets without friendly harbours could not remain at sea forever. Every Phoenician city Alexander captured denied Darius another base from which to threaten Greece, raid the Aegean, or strike behind the Macedonian army while it marched deeper into Asia. That strategy had already produced one of the most extraordinary sieges in ancient history, Tyre. The proud Phoenician city stood on an island roughly half a mile from the mainland, protected by high sea walls, warships, and the belief that no land army could reach it. Alexander disagreed. For 7 grinding months, his men drove stone and timber into the water, extending a causeway toward the island under constant attack. Tyrian ships burned siege works, missiles swept the labourers, and storms tore at the new-made land. When the causeway alone was not enough, Alexander assembled a fleet from the Phoenician and Cypriot cities that had already submitted. Rams attacked the sea walls from ships, troops struck the harbours. The final breakthrough came through a breach in the southern wall, and Tyre fell under assault from land and water together. The price was catastrophic. Ancient casualty numbers vary, as ancient numbers often do, but every surviving tradition agrees on mass killing and enslavement. Tyre had believed the sea would save it. Alexander turned the sea into a road, and while that siege was still consuming men, ships, timber, and time, Darius offered peace. According to Arrian, the Persian king offered 10,000 talents for the return of his captured family. He offered Alexander all territory west of the Euphrates. He offered his own daughter in marriage and proposed an alliance that would divide the empire between them. Parmenion, Alexander's most experienced general, is said to have remarked that if he were Alexander, he would accept. Alexander answered that he would accept too, if he were Parmenion. He didn't want half the empire, he wanted all of it. Darius began raising another army. Alexander continued south toward Egypt. Almost every important city along the coast had already submitted. Gaza did not. Gaza was not built like an ordinary city. Arrian describes it as standing on a lofty mound above an approach of deep, heavy sand. The mound was probably a tell, an elevation formed over generations as settlements rose, fell, and were rebuilt layer upon layer. It was not a natural mountain of loose desert sand, but to the Macedonians below, the difference was academic. Gaza's walls still towered far above the level where ordinary siege engines, rams, towers, or ladders could reach them. The city also stood at the edge of the desert, the last major fortified position on the route from Phoenicia toward Egypt. Alexander could physically march around it, but doing so would leave a hostile Persian garrison behind him near the road, linking his army to the conquered coast. Messages, supplies, reinforcements, and wounded men would all have to pass under the shadow of a city still loyal to Darius. Gaza did not need to defeat Alexander in open battle, it only needed to survive behind him and make the road unsafe. Commanding the city was a man history remembers as Batis. Josephus preserves a different form of the name, Babemeses, but Arrian calls him Batis and describes him as a eunuch in possession of Gaza. Whatever the exact title of his office, he understood the weight of the position he had been ordered to hold. He recruited Arab mercenaries, gathered provisions for a long siege, and decided not to admit Alexander into the city. Arrian says he believed Gaza could not be taken by storm. That belief was not foolish. Gaza had height, walls, supplies, trained defenders, and open ground around it. Alexander had just lost 7 months at Tyre. Darius was rebuilding his strength. Every week, spent beneath Gaza's walls, gave the Persian king more time. Batis did not have to destroy the Macedonian army, he only had to stop the calendar. The dust had barely settled over Tyre when Alexander turned his army south, following the coastal road toward the richest prize left in the Western Persian Empire, Egypt. Every port behind him now served Macedon instead of Persia. Every mile carried him farther from the battlefield Odysseus and closer to the Nile. But one fortress still stood between those two worlds. That fortress was Gaza. The city stood around 20 stades from the sea, close enough to profit from coastal trade, but far enough inland that Alexander's fleet could not simply sail against its walls. Its mound dominated the surrounding plain. Its defences followed the crest, turning the entire city into a fortress, raised above the battlefield before the first soldier arrived. Alexander rode or walked the perimeter and searched for the weakest point. Arrian says he selected the section where the wall appeared easiest to assault, with the main siege works later concentrated against the southern side. Egypt lay beyond that wall, but direction was not the real problem, height was. Alexander ordered his engineers to prepare the machines. They gave him an answer he did not want to hear. The wall could not be taken by force. The mound placed it too high above the surrounding ground. Towers constructed on the plain would stand below the defenders. Rams could not reach useful stone. Ladders would have to climb not only the wall, but the elevation beneath it. Every assault would begin uphill, under fire, against men fighting from above. These were the same engineers who had spent 7 months solving Tyre, while the enemy tried to burn or sink everything they built. If those men said Gaza's wall was unreachable, then Batis had chosen his ground well. But Arrian records something revealing. The more impossible the task appeared, the more determined Alexander became to attempt it. He understood that Gaza mattered twice. It mattered because it guarded the road into Egypt, and it mattered because Alexander's victories had trapped him inside his own reputation. After Granicus, Issus, and Tyre, every resistant city became a public test. If Alexander failed here, the news would travel faster than his army. Darius would hear that the Macedonian advance had finally stopped. Greek cities and uncertain governors would begin calculating again. Alexander said success would terrify his enemies because no one expected Gaza to fall. Failure would bring disgrace before both the Greeks and Darius. Batis had chosen a defence based on height. Alexander chose an answer based on reputation. If the machines could not reach the walls from the existing ground, then the existing ground would no longer be accepted. He would build new ground beneath them. The order moved through the camp. Earth, stone, brushwood, timber and rubble were dragged toward the city. The embankment had to support towers, rams, men and animals without collapsing into the sand beneath it. And all of it had to be built while the defenders watched from above. Arrian says Alexander resolved to construct a mound around the city so that his engines could be brought up level with the walls. He adds that the work was concentrated especially against the southern side where the assault seemed easiest. He then gives a measurement so enormous that it has echoed through every retelling of the siege. 2 stades broad and 250 feet high. That figure should be treated with caution. A continuous ring at that height, built around an entire city in roughly 2 months, would require an almost unbelievable quantity of material. Modern historians therefore suspect exaggeration, or propose several massive ramps and platforms rather than one perfect ring. Arrian's figure may preserve the wonder of the achievement better than an engineer's measurement. But uncertainty does not make the achievement small. Even a fraction of that claimed height meant moving an immense mass of earth under enemy fire. Gaza's advantage came from the mound beneath it. Alexander's men were attempting to build a second mound outside the walls, one basket, one beam, and one stone at a time. Infantrymen became labourers. Men who had crossed Asia in formation now dug, filled baskets, carried loads, cut timber, packed weak sections, and dragged siege machinery toward the rising platform. Specialists directed the work, but ordinary soldiers supplied the force behind it. Every load reduced Gaza's advantage by a few inches. Every inch brought the workers closer to the defenders' missiles. Batis did not sit behind the walls and wait for Alexander's artificial mountain to reach him. Archers and other missile troops fired down on the exposed labourers. The height that made Gaza difficult to assault gave its defenders a clear view of the work below. Men building the mound had to labour beneath shields, screens, and covering fire. Troops assigned to protect them stood ready beside men carrying earth. The Macedonians had to build and fight at the same time. A short attack could undo hours of labour. A burning engine could destroy material hauled into position over days. Gaza did not need to erase the entire embankment. It only needed to make every additional foot cost more than Alexander was willing to pay. Tyre had already answered that question. Alexander was willing to pay for time with labour. He was willing to pay for labour with lives. And before Gaza fell, he would pay with his own blood. As the mound rose beneath Gaza's walls, Arrian places one of the strangest scenes of the siege beside the earthworks. Alexander was preparing to offer sacrifice. He wore a garland and stood near the altar when a bird of prey passed overhead, carrying a stone in its claws. The stone slipped and struck him on the head. Alexander turned to Aristander, the soothsayer who had accompanied the campaign, and asked what the sign meant. The answer carried both victory and danger. The city would be captured. But Alexander had to guard himself that day. To Alexander and his army, this was not decorative superstition. Omens were part of command, and Aristander's warnings could shape real decisions. For a time, the warning worked. Alexander remained near the siege engines and kept himself beyond the reach of missiles. Then Gaza struck. This was not a vague raid carried out through mysterious hidden gates. Arrian gives a clear image. Arab troops surged from the city carrying torches toward the Macedonian siege engines. From the higher ground, defenders hurled missiles down at the men trying to protect the machinery. The Macedonians were fighting uphill from the mound they had built, and the pressure began driving them back. If the defenders broke the line, the engines could burn. Weeks of labour could disappear in minutes. Alexander saw his men giving ground. The warning had been specific. Protect yourself today. He went forward anyway. Taking the shield-bearing guards, Alexander rushed toward the section where the Macedonians were under the greatest pressure. His presence steadied the defence. The men rallied around him. Gaza's sortie failed to sweep them from the mound. Then the prophecy found him. A bolt fired from a catapult drove through Alexander's shield, pierced his breastplate and struck deep into his shoulder. A missile had passed through shield and armour before reaching the king. Arrian says the injury was difficult to heal. For an army built around one man's authority, the danger was larger than the wound itself. If Alexander died outside Gaza, the campaign could fracture before Darius returned to the field. Yet Arrian gives the moment an almost unnerving turn. When Alexander realized that Aristander's warning about injury had come true, he reportedly rejoiced. If the prophecy had been right about the wound, then he believed it would also be right about the city. He had been struck. Therefore Gaza would fall. The wound did not automatically create the later story about Batis. Curtius connects Alexander's fury to Batis's defiance after the capture, not explicitly to the bolt in his shoulder. But Gaza had now done what few enemies had managed to do. It had stopped Alexander. It had burned time he could not recover, and it had reached through shield and armour to wound him personally. The siege continued while the injury healed slowly. The mound kept rising, damaged sections were repaired, new material was hauled forward. Protective troops remained close to the workers, and the defenders kept watching from the walls. Gaza had failed to destroy the engines during the sortie, but the city was still standing, and every day of survival remained a victory for Batis. Then help arrived from Tyre. The enormous engines that had battered the island city's defences were transported south by sea. That journey revealed how completely Alexander's coastal strategy had reversed Persian power. Harbours that had once supported the Persian fleet now carried Macedonian siege machinery toward the next Persian fortress. The weapons of Tyre were coming to Gaza. Bringing them inland and onto the Mound was another battle against weight and ground. Routes were strengthened, teams of men and animals hauled the machines upward, and the surface beneath them had to hold. Slowly the engines climbed. For weeks, Gaza's defenders had looked down on machines that could not touch them. Now those machines rose toward the level of the walls. When the first heavy rams began striking stone, the entire character of the siege changed. Missile engines drove defenders back from battlements and towers. Protective structures moved closer. Blows that had once fallen short now shook the wall directly. Gaza still possessed height, but it no longer possessed complete control of it. Alexander's engineers did not rely on impact alone. They attacked from below. Arrian says the Macedonians dug mines in several places and secretly removed earth from beneath the foundations. These were not tunnels designed primarily to carry men into the city. They were hollow spaces intended to make the walls collapse under their own weight. Sappers worked where Gaza's defenders could not easily see the danger, weakening the support beneath sections already battered from above. The attack now came in layers. Rams struck the visible stone, missiles swept the battlements, sappers removed the earth beneath the foundations. The defenders could rush toward one damaged tower while another section was being emptied from below. They could repair cracks in daylight and still lose a wall whose support had disappeared underground. Gaza's greatest strength had always been the mound beneath it. Alexander was now turning that earth into a weapon. Sections began to fail. Stone shifted. Foundations gave way. Breaches opened where the wall had stood unbroken. The Macedonians gained better firing positions. Scaling ladders could finally be carried toward damaged sections that were no longer impossibly high. The artificial mountain had done its work, but a breach is not a victory. A breach forces attackers into a narrow, broken space under concentrated fire. Rubble shifts beneath their feet. Defenders know exactly where the enemy must come. The larger army cannot use its full numbers. Only the men at the front can climb, and those men can die before the ranks behind them move a single step. Gaza used that advantage once, then twice, then 3 times. Arrian tells us the defenders withstood 3 Macedonian assaults despite suffering heavy losses. He does not preserve a complete tactical account of each attempt, and there is no need to invent one. The result is powerful enough. 3 times Alexander's men attacked the damaged defences. 3 times they were driven back. The mound had been built, the engines had arrived, the walls had been battered, mines had torn at the foundations. Alexander himself had been wounded. Still Gaza held. By the 4th assault, the siege was no longer a story about one brilliant idea solving an impossible problem. The mound had only made the battle possible. Batis and his defenders still had to be broken at the wall, and 3 times they had proved they could survive everything Alexander brought against them. Now he prepared to bring everything at once. Quick pause. If you're enjoying this kind of deep, brutal military history, I want to mention something I personally use in my own research and browsing: NordVPN. It helps keep your connection private and secure when you're working online. If you want to check it out, the link is in the description. Now let us get back to Gaza, because the first 3 assaults have failed, and the 4th is about to decide the city. The 4th assault did not begin as another narrow push against a single damaged section. Alexander committed pressure from every side. The phalanx advanced around the city. Engines battered a wider stretch of wall. Undermined sections were brought down. Scaling ladders moved toward the gaps. Missile troops tried to clear defenders from the points where men would climb. Gaza had survived 3 storms by concentrating resistance where the Macedonians entered. Now the entire perimeter seemed to move. As the ladders went forward, another contest began inside the larger battle. Macedonian officers competed for the honour of being first over the wall. This was not empty bravado. Alexander's army ran on recognition as well as discipline. A man who performed a conspicuous act of courage could be rewarded before the entire army, promoted, remembered, and praised among his companions. The first man into a defended city also placed himself where death was most likely. Arrian names the winner. Neoptolemus, one of Alexander's companions and a member of the Aeacid family, reached the top first. The name carried an almost perfect piece of ancient irony. The Aeacids claimed descent from Achilles. Alexander's own royal line also traced itself toward the same heroic ancestry, and early in the campaign he had honoured Achilles at Troy. The first Macedonian over Gaza's wall therefore came from the legendary line of the hero Alexander admired most. One rank followed another. Men climbed over broken stone, ladders, and each other. Officers hauled troops toward the foothold. Defenders rushed to contain the first Macedonians before the opening widened. For a few moments, the entire city balanced on whether those men at the top could survive long enough for others to join them. They did. Once enough Macedonians were inside, they moved toward the gates and broke them open from within. That was the decisive moment. As long as Gaza controlled its walls and entrances, Alexander's larger army could be forced through narrow gaps. Once the gates opened, the city lost the ability to control how many enemies entered. Macedonian troops poured through entrances the defenders had spent 2 months protecting. The outer battle was over. The killing was not. Arrian does not give us an invented map of every alley or describe fighting door by door. He gives us a simpler image, and in many ways a harsher one. Even when the city was already in enemy hands, the men of Gaza stood together and continued fighting where each had been stationed. They did not scatter. They did not surrender. They died at their posts. The surviving sources do not give us a reliable strength for the garrison. Curtius supplies large numbers, but ancient casualty totals at sieges are notoriously difficult to trust. We cannot separate every Persian soldier from every Arab mercenary or every local defender. We cannot know the words shouted from the walls as the gates opened. We know the result. The male defenders were killed. The women and children were sold into slavery. This was a common ancient consequence for a city taken after prolonged resistance, but calling it common does not make it less devastating. Gaza's population was stripped away because the city had refused to open its gates before Alexander forced them open himself. Yet Gaza was not burned into permanent ruin. Alexander needed the position. Arrian says he repopulated the city with people from neighbouring settlements and turned it into a fortified base for the continuing war. That decision reveals the strategic purpose behind everything that had happened. Alexander did not spend 2 months raising an artificial approach merely to leave a field of ashes. He wanted Gaza functioning under Macedonian control, guarding the same road it had once threatened. The population could be replaced, the position could not. By any conventional measure, the siege was over. The last hostile fortress on the road toward Egypt had fallen. Diodorus gives the duration as roughly 2 months. The garrison was destroyed, the road south was secure, the engines could be dismantled, moved, or abandoned. Alexander could march. But the most famous scene attached to Gaza begins after the military story ends, and it comes from a different source. Arrian, who gives us the Mound, the Omen, the Sortie, the Wound, the Mines, the 4 assaults, Neoptolemus, the Gates, and Gaza's repopulation, says nothing about the fate of Batis. Diodorus is brief. Josephus preserves the siege duration and a different form of Batis's name, but not the punishment that later made the governor famous. The full surviving confrontation comes from Quintus Curtius Rufus, a Roman historian writing centuries after Alexander. In Curtius's version, Batis was captured alive and brought before the king. He had not fled before the 4th assault. He had not come out asking for terms. He had not killed himself when the gates opened. Now the city was gone, the garrison was dead, and the man who had delayed Alexander for 2 months stood in front of him. Curtius says Batis refused to perform the submission, expected from a defeated enemy. He did not kneel. He did not beg. He did not answer Alexander's threats. Batis simply looked back at him in silence. That silence becomes the centre of Curtius's scene. Alexander had taken the mound, the walls, the gates, the garrison, and the city. But he could not force the defeated commander to ask for mercy. The military struggle had ended. The final contest was no longer over Gaza. It was over who controlled the meaning of defeat. Curtius presents Alexander's anger turning into fury. Then he reaches backward, from Gaza to Troy. Alexander's identification with Achilles did not begin at Gaza. Early in the Asian campaign, he had visited the landscape associated with Troy. Plutarch says he honoured Achilles' tomb with a garland, and called the hero fortunate because he had found a faithful friend in life and a great poet to preserve his fame after death. Alexander wanted both things for himself, loyalty while he lived, and immortality through the story told after he was gone. Plutarch also preserves the famous tradition that Alexander carried a special recension of the Iliad, associated with Aristotle, and kept it near his dagger beneath his pillow. Whether every physical detail of that later image is exact matters less than the truth behind it. Alexander did not merely enjoy Homer, he understood himself through Homer. Achilles was the model of speed, courage, rage, loyalty, victory and fame. He was also a warning. In the Iliad, Achilles kills Hector and then refuses to treat the fallen prince with dignity. Consumed by grief and fury, he fastens Hector's body behind his chariot and drags it outside Troy. The poem does not present this as a clean heroic triumph. Achilles has won the battle but lost control of himself. The scene becomes one of the darkest moments in the epic, resolved only when the old King Priam enters the Greek camp and begs for the return of his son. Curtius turns Batis into Alexander's Hector. According to his account, Alexander ordered Batis fastened behind a chariot while the governor was still alive. The chariot was then driven around Gaza, with Alexander claiming to follow the example of his ancestor Achilles. The imitation was even darker than the poem. Hector was already dead. Curtius says Batis was not. The scene has survived for more than 2,000 years because it is almost too perfectly designed to be forgotten. The silent defender, the wounded conqueror, the city walls, the chariot, and the king reenacting the worst act of the hero he admired most. It is also where responsible history has to separate a powerful ancient story from an undisputed fact. Arrian does not report the execution, Diodorus does not report it, Josephus does not report it. Curtius gives the only full surviving narrative of the confrontation and the deliberate imitation of Achilles, although a fragment connected with the lost historian Hegesias also preserves a hostile tradition about Alexander's treatment of Batis. That silence in other major sources does not automatically make Curtius false. Ancient historians selected different material. Arrian often concentrated on marches, battles, engineering, command decisions, and the military sequence. A cruel act could have been omitted by one tradition and preserved by another. Alexander was capable of severe and theatrical punishment, and Curtius may have inherited the episode from earlier Greek sources now lost. But there are reasons for doubt. Curtius writes with a strong dramatic and moral purpose. Across his history, Alexander's victories increasingly reveal pride, anger, excess, and the corruption of unchecked power. The Batis scene fits that design with extraordinary precision. A silent governor becomes Hector. Alexander becomes an enraged Achilles. Gaza becomes Troy. History and literature lock together so neatly that modern historians have questioned whether the details preserve an exact event, an exaggerated one, or a story reshaped later to expose Alexander's character. The honest version is not that the dragging definitely happened exactly as Curtius describes it. The honest version is that Curtius says it happened, that other major surviving accounts do not confirm it, and that scholars still disagree over how much of the scene to accept. That uncertainty does not make the ending weaker, it changes the question. If the story is true, Gaza ended with one of the most personal acts of vengeance in Alexander's career. If the story was shaped or invented later, then an ancient historian still believed this was the right image through which to judge him. Either way, Gaza brought two Alexanders into the same frame. The first was the commander who could reshape the battlefield itself. He coordinated labourers, infantry, missile troops, naval transport, siege engines, miners, and repeated assaults, until a wall declared unreachable was finally reached. The second was the conqueror whose victories could become theatre, a king who wanted not only obedience but recognition, submission, and a place inside the heroic world he had carried with him since childhood. Gaza did not introduce cruelty into an otherwise clean career. Alexander had already destroyed Thebes after rebellion in 335 BC. Tyre had already ended in mass killing and enslavement. Ruthlessness was not new. What made the Batis tradition different was its intimacy. A city can be destroyed in the language of strategy. A population can be punished in the language of deterrence. Curtius's Alexander focuses on one man who will not kneel and tries to break the silence that military victory has failed to control. Batis has lost everything, but he will not beg. Alexander has won everything. But the silence is unbearable. Homer supplies the script, and whether the final scene is precise history or carefully shaped tradition, it became one of the images through which later generations judged the conqueror. Alexander wanted the glory of Achilles. At Gaza, The tradition made him inherit Achilles' rage. Gaza's fall opened the road south almost immediately. Arrian says Alexander marched from Gaza and reached Pelusium in Egypt on the 7th day. His fleet was already waiting there. Mazaces, the Persian official governing Egypt, had no major army with which to resist. He knew Darius had fled at Issus. He knew Phoenicia had fallen. He knew Tyre had been broken and Gaza had finally opened. Egypt admitted Alexander without a battle. That contrast gives the siege its strategic meaning. At Gaza, the Macedonians spent roughly 2 months digging, hauling, building, defending engines, surviving sorties, mining foundations, and launching 4 assaults. After Gaza, the road into Egypt opened in 7 days. Alexander continued to Memphis, established his rule, founded Alexandria, and later crossed the desert to consult the Oracle of Ammon at Siwa. Those events came after Gaza, not before it. The Egyptian tradition linking Alexander with Amun had not yet formed while the siege engine stood below Batis's walls, but the heroic mythology was already there. Alexander had already honoured Achilles. He already interpreted conquest through impossible trials, legendary ancestors, sacrifices, and signs from the gods. At Gaza, Arrian gives him an omen promising victory and warning of injury. The warning comes true. The city eventually falls. Curtius then gives the victory a darker mythic ending, turning Alexander into Achilles and Batis into another Hector. The secure military story is dramatic enough without invention. A city rises above deep sand on a fortified mound. Engineers tell Alexander its walls cannot be taken by force. He orders the earth raised beneath his machines. Gaza attacks the works with torches. A prophecy warns the king to protect himself, and a catapult bolt pierces shield and armour into his shoulder. Engines arrive from Tyre. Sappers hollow the foundations. 3 assaults fail. On the 4th, Neoptolemus reaches the wall first. The gates are broken open from inside, and the defenders die where they stand. Then comes the disputed ending. Curtius asks us to see a conqueror who has captured everything except the submission of 1 prisoner. Modern scholarship asks whether the scene preserves a real act, exaggerates one, or transforms Alexander into a moral character inside a Roman history. We cannot settle that dispute with certainty. We can tell it honestly. Gaza was not burned out of existence. Alexander repopulated it and retained it as a fortified base because the city remained too valuable to destroy permanently. The same location that had delayed him now protected the road behind him. The exact shape and dimensions of the artificial mound cannot now be reconstructed with certainty. Ancient Gaza lies beneath generations of destruction, rebuilding, and settlement. But the central image remains. Alexander arrived before walls his engineers said he could not reach, so he ordered the ground raised beneath him. Batis had trusted Gaza's height to stop the most successful army of the age. For roughly 2 months, through missiles, fire, a wounded king, collapsing stone, underground mines, and 3 failed assaults, that judgment almost held. Then the 4th assault came. The gates opened from inside, and according to Curtius Rufus, the story ended not with a surrender, but with a silent prisoner, an enraged king, and a punishment borrowed from the darkest moment of Alexander's favourite hero. If stories like this, the ones that keep the drama but also show where the sources disagree, are what you come to this channel for, consider joining as a channel member. Members get early access to new videos, behind-the-scenes research on how these scripts come together, and a direct hand in choosing which battles and sieges we cover next. Thanks for watching this deep dive into the Siege of Gaza. I will see you in the next one.